All right, well, good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome back to Valencia College of Westminster. I think it's probably useful for me to say once again, my name is Carl Creason. I'm a professor of history at Valencia College. I work on the East Campus. I'm the chair of the discipline on the East Campus. And it's been my pleasure to volunteer at Westminster on Lakemont in Winter Park for now about 5 years. And in January of 2019, actually in December of 2018, working with James Van Horn, we approached Rebecca about the idea of doing a weekly session or as much as we could. And it's been just a thrill of mine to offer classes on various topics. And when we're able to meet in session in the building, one of the things that I wanted to do and have done is bring other professors with other disciplines to talk to us. So it's not just history. Not everybody likes history. I try to do a good job, but it's other interests of likes. And hopefully we'll be able to get back to that at some point. I'm sure everybody knows by now, Florida's entering a phase 2 on Friday. So I guess we're going to all watch and see kind of what that means. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to spend time here and sharing. You're all my parents' age. And I think of them when I'm getting a chance to talk with you. And the whole intent is to offer you a college level class and not dumbing it down. And sometimes I'm enjoying being with you more than my students because I actually go slower and have the opportunity to dig even a little deeper than I am with my students, because we obviously have some restrictions with the students to how much time we have in a given semester. So we've covered a lot of ground over the 2.5 years or year and a half, maybe it's only a year and a half. And we've gone all over the place, again, various topics, but within history, we have looked at recent material. We've looked at the 60s, and we've done a lot of early American history, and we've done some European history. One of my peers came in, we did a month on the Roman Empire, which was wonderful. So it hasn't been like a programmatic, like we're going to go through these various things. So we've held various topics. And I will say again for you, either those of you with me now or somebody who's listening to this later, if you had a topic that you're like, oh, I really, really want to have this topic covered, I would love for you to tell me. You can do that by direct email. You can get to Becca, who is the person in charge of programming for the Westminster at Lakemont facility, and she can send it to me. I'm always eager to know things that you want to cover. So this topic that we're going to move into, the U.S. Civil War, was one of the topics that someone some time ago said, oh, I really want you to cover that. And so I thought, yeah, we will. I had no idea when we were planning this, and I was thinking about it about a month and a half ago, that everything that transpired in Minneapolis would transpire. And that's sparking a whole new round of protests and concerns nationally about the direction of the country. And so my wife was saying to me, she said, well, it's kind of apropos, you're doing the Civil War starting tonight. And I'm like, yep, I understand. It is. And so maybe it'll be useful. I mean it to be useful. I told Mr. Van Horn, who I was talking to by email, I wasn't really sure how deep to go, in the sense that certainly I could tell you about the Civil War in 2 sessions, probably 2 hours, 2.5 maybe. But also in my college, I have taught a special topics course on the Civil War, in which, of course, we take the full 15-week semester. So that's 30 sessions of an hour and 15 minutes each. And so I was looking at in fact, I'll even show you, here's the syllabus from that class. So I pulled it up and printed out a copy, and I was looking at it going, well, how do I want to do this? And I will say that as we're going along, there's a part where I'm trying to fill it out as we go. Now, not wanting to bore anybody too deeply, spending, maybe just one night on something that may seem minuscule to them. And at the same time, I don't want to go so fast that, you feel like you really just got a supreme overview, because I want to give you kind of that information and the thoughtfulness about, well, what is involved in this moment. Clearly, when we look at our national history, the Civil War, for now, still remains kind of a hinge moment. It's not exactly in the middle anymore, but it's still kind of a hinge moment in which the country seems to have taken a different direction. So even if someone does not support kind of the theory that I take of Anglo-American history, that there's a repeatable pattern, certainly people think today, they can consider events that are happening today and think of those in reference to, wow, that seems like the US Civil War back in the 1860s. And so it is a main moment to look back at what happened in the country. So I want to give it its due and its focus. So to do that, what we're going to do these first two sessions is kind of lay the foundation. We could obviously just start and say Lincoln was elected and then there's Fort Sumter and dive in. But the problem with that is that many people do not have a solid grasp on, well, what went into that. And I guess I would say it this way. The Civil War was not a surprise. The Civil War was not something that someone could not have seen coming. The Civil War was not something that emerged, ex nihilo, out of nothing, that seemed to just be silly. It is a very deep, complex moment that one could, I would say, seen coming from the beginning, not just because of slavery, which certainly is at the centerpiece of it, but because of some of the philosophical foundation that was laid at the country's beginning. So we've talked about this because the very first thing I did in January of 2019 was we looked at the American Revolution. And so some of the material I'm going to show you now actually comes from slides back then, but not all of you were there then. So I thought it'd be appropriate for us to take some time. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to dive right in to the presentation piece, and we'll see how far we get. As always, I want to tell you that you can feel very free to text, use the chat feature to write me something. And so I certainly can, and if there's a question you want to ask, and yet you don't feel comfortable verbally interrupting, I would love for you to use that feature. And if you don't know on that feature, you can actually write it to individuals privately, so you could actually write to me privately. Of course, again, there's also the participant window, and you can, raise your hand, or you can, do something to flag me down there. There's only a few of us right now on the call, so you certainly don't need to feel worried about interrupting me. So when we talk about the Civil War, let's go ahead and kind of start at the beginning of the war and then back up. So when we look at the war, certainly the period from November to April, November 1860 to April 1861 became really hot and heavy, and things moved really quickly. The election happened in November. By the late part of the month, it was certified. It wasn't really, as today we would know the day after, or usually that night even. Sometimes they'll call the election. That, of course, did not happen. But it became really clear Lincoln was going to win. We'll go more in depth on all these parts later in our weeks from now as we kind of dig into this. South Carolina, which if you were with us when we did the Andrew Jackson series when I was still coming to Westminster, we talked about the nullification crisis, which again we're going to see in a moment. But so South Carolina had already been thinking for a while. Their great leader was a man named John C. Calhoun. He wasn't the governor, but he was really the statewide leader. And he had, for at least the previous 20 years, been arguing the case that South Carolina could not find the proper degree of support that she wanted from the national government in the direction it was going. With Lincoln's election, that was really it for them. Calhoun had passed away, but the leaders then were like, yep, we're out. And so for the next few weeks, the president, James Buchanan, because of course you remember, just because the election happens in November, the current president remains the president. So James Buchanan, who had been an ally for the South, even though he was from Pennsylvania, had been trying to figure out what to do. And of course, lame duck presidents are always in a tricky position, and he wasn't sure, what he needed to do. In January, they decided to send support and food to the troops that were in the harbor. The gentleman in charge of the federal troops in South Carolina had pulled them all out of Charleston to get to the harbor for the purpose of trying to avoid any kind of interaction. They were trying to avoid the same thing that had happened in Boston in 1770 with the Boston Massacre. Just wanted to avoid any of those issues that could inflame passions. In March, Abraham Lincoln gives his inaugural address. And the next month, this is obviously his first thing he deals with. He's like, we're going. And he thought by informing the governor that he could say, hey, look, this is an unarmed ship. It's just food. It's not even more troops. It's just food. That would solve things. But really what Lincoln was doing, and Lincoln was very savvy, he was very politically astute. He was playing a poker game and he pushed some chips in because the point was, if the federal troops could remain on property that was, South Carolinian, then it would make the point that ultimately there still was a nation that could control the land. And the argument the South Carolinians were making was that the land within their geographical boundaries belonged to them and them only. And so this becomes a really big point. So by sending the supplies, Pickens and really Jefferson Davis, who by that point had been the president of the Confederacy, knew that they had been called, as in a poker match. And so they went for it. And so on April the 12th, the cannons started firing. Now, of course, this raises then a whole point of our what will be, again, it's probably going to be 10 weeks of work, maybe more, maybe a little less, we'll see, about how did we get here? What happened? And I would suggest to you that these questions are the ones you kind of want to keep in your mind. When President Bush, George Walker Bush, was president, by 2004 and 5, as you I'm sure remember, there was a lot of dissension in the country. And at that point, when I was teaching my classes, I went and looked, and you can track some of this information down. At that point, there were active secession movements in over 30 states. By the time President Obama left office, I think the number was up to 40 states. So the idea of disunion, even in 2020, is not somehow a foreign concept. And we're going to raise this point again by going backwards, because it's critical to understand it's not as if the South Carolinians in 1860 decided, you know what, we don't like it, we're out, and everybody else was shocked that somebody would think of this idea. Instead, for the whole time, as Lincoln said, of the 407 years ago, or at that point, I guess 403 years ago, disunion had been in the mix philosophically about the country. So we're going back all the way up. And I just show you this slide. You may remember in January of this year, I did a real brief cover of what I had done some teaching at the library, maybe it was in the fall, about the idea that, as I said earlier, I believe Anglo-American history for the past 550 some odd years can be seen as a recurring pattern that moves through a roughly every 80 years from kind of high point of we're all on the same team to divided point where we're in two philosophical camps. And so unfortunately for many, 2020 would be 80 years from the last time that this happened, depending on where exactly you count. And I wrote a small book about it. Two men wrote, many other people have written much bigger books. My book was really focusing on this slide here, that when you get to the point of the crisis, you can track it through all these great crisis moments that we've had. And we've had 5, so we're at number 6 now. They all had the same attributes. And I saw this through my teaching of history because I do survey classes, so we're always kind of moving at the space shuttle level, which basically gives me the ability to see kind of broader patterns, which is why I like it. So these are the things that we're going to be paying attention to as we move in our discussion about the Civil War to the Civil War, because I want to get us to the Civil War, and I want you to understand like what happens. So this slide, we're not going to see this slide again. Let's go back all the way up now. So I want to get a running start to answer these questions, right? How did it come to this? So all the way back, Jamestown, 1608. By the time we get to the 1700s, there's 13 random colonies. They were largely left on their own, and they largely operated independently of one another. In fact, not till the 1740s, 1750s was there really an idea that they could be something together. But the First Great Awakening and the French and Indian War, which begins in the 1750s, were these two moments that began to alert the British citizens living in North America that they were maybe something different. However, they were still thinking in terms of independence. So what I do in Pennsylvania has nothing to do with what you do in New York. They were thinking, as we often think about Europe today, that France is not Italy, Italy's not Switzerland, Switzerland's not Hungary. And so that's how they were thinking, largely because they'd been left on their own. They had self-ruled, which was an important thing. And the revolution begins at the end of the time of the French and Indian War. Of course, the revolution was really about control more than anything else. And we talked about this, 2 years ago when we did the topic. It's not really about taxes. It's not really about voting. It's not really about wealth. It's not really about representation. It's really about control. And the Americans, or the British citizens living in North America, wanted to have their own self-control. You could say self-rule, if that works better for you. It's interesting when you study the revolution, and we may do the revolution again, we probably will in a couple of years because I love it so much and I love talking to you guys, is that what you see is all the complaints that are usually listed and that the middle schoolers would tell you this is why there's a revolution. They're all wrong when you actually look at England. And so what you see is these Americans, these British citizens in North America, rebelling against the most liberal nation on the planet. And they had a constitution, nobody else did. They had a series of rights, Bill of Rights, nobody else did. The Americans were the freest, they're actually the richest. But we can see, because they were still rebelling, that they were arguing for some new ideas. And when you study the history of ideas, it is at this moment that you start hearing of new concepts, such as capitalism and free trade, such as a more broad spread representation amongst all peoples, not just the nobility, such as voting, such as a more clearly written set of laws. The British Constitution is a very loose set of laws that everybody knew, but they couldn't point to a piece of paper. So some of these ideas are what really spills out in the revolution. And of course, we fought a war over it. And we didn't actually win. Britain quit, which, by the way, if you want to study the Vietnam War, was a lesson that we obviously failed to really comprehend, that Britain showed us the way. It was a little better, but that's a different conversation. But we still secure the independence. 1781, 1783, there's a treaty signed, Ben Franklin, John Adams. They're over there, they sign it, and we're good. So now we're off and running. But they wanted to write a set of rules to express what this new country would be. So they do in what's called the Articles of Confederation. Now it's interesting to look at what they were trying to do with this revolution. And it's interesting to see what they did accomplish. So they did accomplish the beginning of the American experiment. But then there was a lot of questions that they simply didn't answer. And they were going to be, it's why it's an experiment, right? Scientists, some of you may be scientists. You have a hypothesis, you think of what might be true, and then you test it. And that's really what we've done. I was in an interview just this past week, which once it comes out, I'll give you guys a link if you want it. And the interviewer was asking me questions about the American experiment. And I had to correct him because what he was defining as the American experiment, in my opinion, actually wasn't the American experiment. Here's the American experiment: that can the common citizens participate? And again, you have to put it in reference point to the time. In the 1700s, you still would find very few places on the planet that allowed average people like you and me to be able to participate. There still was this sense in which participation was only allowed by a control agency, whether that was the church or the nobility or a king. And so the Americans were saying, no, we're gonna let average people do it. So that happened along with free trade and basic idea of rights. But who is government? Is government us or them? Can we do this style of government on a large geographical scale? It had not been successfully done to date. And what do you do about slavery? They've had slaves since the early 1600s, as we're going to see in a moment, but can you have slaves and still be promoting the idea of free liberty for individuals? How do you wrestle with that? And so they're struggling as they go forward with that. They end up writing a document that reflects John Locke. So we've covered Locke several times in here before, so I want to go quickly past this just to move through. Remember, Locke was writing in the 1600s at the latter part when one of the previous great crisis moments had occurred. in England, the crisis of the discussion about absolutism versus a parliamentarian constitutional monarchy. The English Bill of Rights is written at this time. And so he writes 2 treatises of government. And for Locke, it's critical to understand that the basic premise is that the individual is naturally good and naturally designed to work in cooperation with one another. Everybody has rights given by God. The rights are life, liberty, and property. And these are just because you're alive, you have this. And therefore, because of that, there's no need for a strong government. To put it in modern terms, Locke would say, we don't need the government to tell us not to go out because of coronavirus, or that you have to wear a mask, because everyone is good and they will just do that. And of course, having said that, you automatically should think in your head, well, that's clearly not happening. So right, that's a critique back to Locke. Right? Now, there's another part that goes with this, which we'll get to in just a moment, that normally I teach it that way, but we're going to stop here with Locke. Because if you understand Locke, you understand where the founders were going, and you'll understand the Civil War. Because as much as the Civil War is certainly about slavery, there is this debate about the philosophical differences. And so if you're arguing a Lockean worldview, then you are automatically arguing that if there is a central government, it must be limited. It cannot have excessive powers. Again, to make it modern, Locke would say not only you don't need the government to pass a rule about face masks, the government should not have the power to pass a rule about face masks. Like the government would never dream to pass such a rule because the government would know that it has such limited powers. Now, this is really vital to get, regardless of how you feel about the face mask, because you can't understand what South Carolina and the others are trying to argue until you get this Lockean position. So they put it together in this Articles of Confederation. Now, of course, Locke's dead by this point, but Locke becomes central. Now, there's others. Rousseau is very important at this point, Montesquieu to a lesser degree. And they're trying to create a type of government that's a republic. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but when they talk about the republic, in their minds, they're thinking of avoiding what they perceive to be 2 extremes. And I like to loosely say it this way. James Ellis calls it this way too. You know, they're trying to avoid snob rule, and they're trying to avoid mob rule. So they don't want any of those things, which you can see. But now this is critical because most Americans don't understand this. They didn't want democracy either. So both of those are bad from our founders' point of view. Again, you don't have to agree. You can like any one of those, but just understand from where our founders were going. So to do that, again, as I said, they create a document called the Articles of Confederation. Now, immediately, because we're in a class on the Civil War, hopefully your brain just jumped off the page and go, wait a minute, Confederation, that's that same word. That's what the Southerners are going to do. And we will, in a couple of weeks, take a look at the Constitution of the Confederate States of America so you can see it. But when they choose that word, Confederate, for Confederate States of America, they are very intentionally doing that. Today, that is completely lost. You can't bring this up in public conversations today or you'll get in trouble. But they're automatically, when they write their Constitution in 1861, spring of 61, they are thinking back to this moment and this document because they will be positioning themselves in 1860 and 61 as the equivalent of the first American patriots who were fighting for freedoms expressed within their own individual states. And that was a confederation, the way they saw it. That's why they used the word. So John Dickinson writes this thing in 76 and 77. He's really borrowing heavily from Franklin. And then it's ratified during the war. And it doesn't go well, quite honestly. And we'll see that. But again, the document was reflective of their view. Power was with the states, not with the national government. The states were sovereign. The government had very limited roles. They couldn't do things. They couldn't even have a national currency. So there were 14 different currencies. And And so the national government was weak, and that was intentional. But it didn't go all that well initially. They have no credit. Jefferson is in Paris as our ambassador. John Adams is in London as our ambassador. And both men would write back to Congress over and over and over again, basically saying we're like the laughing stocks. We have no credit. We have no way to prove anything. The debt from the war was just devastating to the economy. And so they were struggling to get it. You can see it early in the Congress passes a request for money. When they would pass a bill requesting money, they had to ask each state to contribute a piece of it. And you can see the states basically just laugh at them. They don't do it, which if the states are supreme, then we all understand that. But then you and I can then say, wow, that'd be really hard to run a larger system if the individual pieces within the system could refuse to participate. And so ultimately, by the time you get to the middle part of the 1780s, so just after a few years, it's not going well. And some of our young leaders, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, really lead the way in saying this isn't going well. Madison had been in Congress. He thought it was very frustrating. He was a very studious young man. He was somebody who had really put a lot of effort in, and if I'm supposed to be in Congress, I want to be in Congress and trying to do things. And there'd be times when there would be no quorum, people didn't come, and he just got really annoyed and began to start thinking in terms of we've got to tighten this up. So in essence, although I think Madison in particular would dispute this, he's thinking about the opposite member of the debate about English philosophy. So on the one hand, John Locke, on the other hand, Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes precedes Locke. He writes at the end of the English Civil War that occurs in the 1640s. And for Hobbes, he takes almost a completely opposite position of Locke, or more appropriately, Locke takes the opposite position of Hobbes. Hobbes' position is that people are naturally not good. Now, it's not quite fair to say that he thought they were evil. That word gets used a lot. But he just thought people in their natural state acted for themselves only. And the phrase to use is self-focused. Again, people like to sometimes say, Hobbes said people were selfish. And I always try to urge people not to say it that way, because none of us wants to be called selfish. Selfish is a moral word, and most of us, been brought up to selfish is bad. So we're like, I'm not selfish. I might know somebody who's selfish, but I'm not selfish. And when you read Hobbes, what you can really see that he's saying is that every human has a focus on themselves. And every human I know, and I know me better than I know any of you, is actually self-focused. I've never met anybody who's not self-focused. Now, it's on a scale, right? So we might think of Mother Teresa as an example of someone who's very much not much self-focused, or say Dr. King, right? That putting others first. But at the root of both those people, I can guarantee you they're still self-focused. It's our natural state, in my opinion. And this was Hobbes' position. And so because of this, he said you couldn't allow the society to just sort of operate on its own. Instead, you needed the Leviathan. And of course, he uses a biblical word that they would have known very well at the time, but basically this big, huge sea creature. That's why in the cover of the book, you can see over here, it's like this person kind of rising out of the sea, like somebody from, King Neptune or something. And he's pointing that because he wants everybody to get this idea of this creature for whom everyone would be in awe or fear of, because the creature, and you can see the quote there at the bottom of the page there, the person in this role has the responsibility of keeping everybody. Now, I've had students say, well, what citizen would do this? And I said, no, you're missing the point. For Hobbes, there is no citizen who could do this. So the only person who could do this would be God for Hobbes. So then God won't come down himself, so God has to choose a representative. And that representative would be expressed in the monarchy. Now, there's a lot of problems with that if Hobbes were here, I think I would walk him through about 300 years before his time to kind of show you how there's not a real clear line of somehow God always having monarchs. But that's the position that he takes. So therefore, for you and me, we don't have to read Hobbes as saying there must be a monarchy, but what you see Hobbes saying is there must be strong power in the central government. So now you can begin to see the debate for Madison and Hamilton versus his opponents, right? So there's several people that are the rock stars of the revolution. That the moment Madison and Hamilton begin making this move to say, let's meet and rewrite or fix the Articles of Confederation, they begin calling it out. They start calling it treasonous. Patrick Henry just starts, going guns blazing against what they're going to do because they realize it's a Hobbesian move. And so again, you have to put it in this understanding of with Locke on the one hand, we're talking about limited power in the central government. And with Hobbes, on the other hand, you're talking about stronger power in the central government. And both men are placing that question of power in relationship to their view of the human. Now, I would suggest, and I think many people have since, that it's not an either or, but it's a continuum. So if you think of like a video game and you're playing it, you've got a lever. So you're about to start the game of you get to be in charge of the country. Where do you put the lever between, a completely Locke or completely Hobbes? Where do you want to slide the lever? And then with that imagery in your mind, I think you can better understand how we end up at these moments of division, because as we're seeing expressed in our own day, and again, I'm just using the example of mask as a simple illustration that's fresh for all of us, whether or not the government can make you or business can make you wear a mask is really reflective of how one, the individual, perceives what they want in power of government. And if you could be in charge of the country right now, whether you would demand everybody wear a mask or whether you would think they couldn't really begins to reflect where you would put the lever, right? So there's not a right answer. I mean, there's what you think is right and what I think is right. And so this becomes the challenge for the country over, well, I would say all of our time, even to this very moment, the debates that we see even preceding coronavirus, running into the election, running into the early, 2019 and now into 2020, and the debates that we would have traditionally been seeing on TV commercials and stuff already about the election are really questions about Locke and Hobbes. It's going to talk about Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, but it's really talking about Locke and Hobbes. Where do you as an individual citizen today in 2020 want to put that lever? And of course, you probably can think about various and sundry topics I could toss out, and then you can probably imagine how various Americans would change their mind, whether it's marijuana or whether it was abortion, whether it was welfare, whether it's spending money on the military. And all of a sudden, you see how hard this becomes. It's not just in the abstract of, oh, I want limited government. I don't want them to do anything. But then once you get into the narrow parts of it, it gets really, really tricky. And it was for these guys as well. Well, Madison's able to get something done. He's not able to get where he wants. Notice there in the middle, he really thought it was important to walk away from Philadelphia with an understanding that the national government was supreme. He was not able to get that across. I'm not surprised. I think he was sad, but I don't think he was surprised either. And what that meant was, even after writing the second Constitution, which we call the Constitution, what was really happening at that point was we already had sown the seeds of a civil war, because it wasn't clear, even with a stronger central government in our Constitution, who had the ultimate power. And so the men who wrote the Constitution, who, by the way, were different men than those who wrote the Declaration, largely, still could not come to bring themselves to say the federal government is supreme. So they left open this idea of, well, maybe a state is supreme. And so ambiguity ruled the day through a series of compromises. And as it relates to slavery, one of the most offensive and saddening things that was done was how to get past this potential division, and they do it with the 3/5 compromise. So again, just to make the point, this 3/5 compromise is related to integral questions of like how the government will be expressed. By this point, they've decided there will be representation by population. By this point, they've also decided that the taxation question, remember I told you a moment ago, the Articles of Confederation, Congress asked for a certain amount of money and the states said, no, I'm not doing it. So now we're going to be more specific and say the new federal government can and will get this money from each state through taxation, through some form of taxation. But what percentage will everybody pay? And again, the decision was kind of connected to population. So into this mix comes the question of what about these slaves? And it really shows you how complicated this issue of slavery becomes. The Southern leaders were like, well, we should get to count them. To which Northern abolition leaders, and there were some in Philadelphia at that point, said, wait, are they people? If they're people, how can you hold them? And so then Southern leaders like, no, they're property. Okay, well, if they're property, then they don't count for taxation or for representation. But Southern leaders could already tell population was going to grow faster in the North than the South for various reasons. There's 2 or 3 reasons why that was true. So they didn't want that to happen. They were already afraid of a future where they would be outnumbered. So ultimately, unfortunately, they come to this conclusion to count every slave as 3/5 of a person. And sometimes you'll read online, people, historians, I suppose, try to softening this and go, oh, they just counted the slave population at 3/5 or 3/5 of a group, or for every 5 people, they count at 3. No. Be more offended. You need to kind of swallow this offense and see the harshness of the words. It's 3/5 of a human. And so that's got to just sit in there, and we can't soft pedal it. And so, you know, these compromises were critical to getting through, again, the history of disunion, which I'm about to show you. But it shows us how challenging this thing is going to be as we go forward. Now, to show you how complicated it was moving from the Confederation Articles to the Constitution, Madison basically cheats. What we had said at the Declaration and what was the rules for the Confederation was that we would only do things unanimously. And Madison's like, no way. He already knew that was going to be a no way because Rhode Island refused to even come to Philadelphia. So Rhode Island's like, yeah, we're not doing this. We don't believe this is going to be right. In fact, the first 3 or 4 years, Rhode Island was not in the country technically because they refused to sign the Constitution. And under President Washington, they will eventually negotiate with Rhode Island. North Carolina's had polled their representatives. They'd shown up at Philadelphia. And then when they found out what Madison was going to do, they bailed. So you already had 2 states down, so you're not going to get unanimous. So they chose to do it with the 9 states, basically 3/4. And it was very, very close, as you can see, and particularly in the big states. So, I mean, it's nice for some of the smaller states to say they were cool with it, but obviously you needed Virginia and New York and Massachusetts, and they're very close. And so this raised a whole bunch of issues. And when we did the Constitution, which we did in the middle part of 2019, we spent a lot more time talking about kind of what was going on here. But I just want you to see it, that it wasn't, and many people miss this, somehow the story sometimes is suggested that the Constitution was this moment when we were all united and we all agreed on everything. No. I have a map that I sometimes show you guys on this point. But if you look at the map, it's like those geographic maps showing where the voting occurred. You would conclude the Constitution would have lost based on the geography. More people were opposed. And they were opposed because of its Hobbesian leanings, which is why the continued pressure from men like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry was about the issue of where is the protection of rights. Now Madison had an answer for that. Madison's answer was that he believed the Constitution would be strictly understood, meaning if it didn't say anything about face masks, then the government can't make a law about face masks. But his opponents went the other direction and said, no, politicians will read it loosely. And if it doesn't say they can't do anything about face masks, well, then they might. And this comes up really early in Washington's administration with the National Bank. So they passed these amendments, but I want you to notice Amendment 9 and 10. They're the ones most people don't realize or don't pay attention. Everybody knows 1 and 2 and maybe 4, but nobody really pays attention to the others. But when you look at these, 9 and 10 indicate to us how already at the founding of the Constitution, so that's 10 years after the founding of the nation, you can see that division is going to be in the mix, because it basically undercuts, Amendment 10 undercuts the Constitution in total and raises that issue back to using face mask as an example, or the national bank if you want to. If the national bank is not mentioned in the Constitution, then according to Amendment 10, they should not be allowed to do one, which is the very argument that Jefferson makes to Washington when Hamilton brings up his economic plan. Jefferson's like, you can't do that. That's not in the Constitution. Amendment 10. Now, Hamilton argues back with, I think it's Section 1, Article 8 in the part about Congress, where we get the necessary and proper clause, where it says Congress shall do whatever is necessary and proper for the good administration of the country. So Hamilton says, hey, a bank's useful. President Obama said, hey, national health care is useful. And currently President Trump is saying, hey, face masks are useful. Or he might not be saying it, but different governors are. All that is an example of the necessary and proper clause. So this shows us we're going to have this ongoing tension between these two documents. The Constitution and the Declaration are not complementary documents that somehow work hand in hand. They're in one sense contradictory documents that work against each other. Now, that's not a bad thing. It provides a tension that provides stability. But it's still important to understand that, when you read the Declaration, you're getting a Lockean tone that suggests, hey, kind of do what you want, keep out everybody else's way. We know you'll be nice. You don't need anybody to be your ruler, right? When you read the Constitution, you see we need some rules. We need some strict boundaries. There's a bunch of stuff we're going to do. And this government at the national level will have the power to make that happen. And so these are two separate things reflecting these two men. Now, because of that, let's back up for a second and just see what is going on with secession. Secession is not a new idea when we get in 1860. Instead, it's been there from the beginning. So I already showed you that first part there. But right out the gate, you have people threatening to secede. And the best example of this is when Congress passed a new tax on whiskey. And out in Pennsylvania, in the western counties near modern-day Pittsburgh, they rebelled. They said, we don't pay taxes. And in their minds, the rebellion in 1791 was really no different than the rebellion in 1765. And they're right. It wasn't any different, except back to the is government us or them. Washington's argument was like, wait a minute, we're all the government together. You can't rebel against us now. To which the Pennsylvanians were like, watch us. And so, you get this moment, and they threatened secession. So what did Washington do? He sent an army out there. He sent troops out there. He didn't just sit around and wait and hope the local officials will handle it. He sent the army marching out there to suppress the rebellion. And then he captured about 20 people, tried them. They were all convicted of treason. And then he wisely did not have them executed, but the point had been made who had the power, but the point had also been made the people will rebel if they feel like it. Then under President Adams, due to the French Revolution and eventually the passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, another moment comes, and this one becomes really important for us because it involves Jefferson and Madison. After the Alien and Sedition Acts are passed to try to help the country navigate this war with France, the quasi-war, in secret, Jefferson for Kentucky and Madison for Virginia will write two documents that are always kind of historically married together. And in these documents, they express that the state has the right, sort of aiming at the 10th Amendment, sort of aiming at just the broader topic of states' rights, to nullify a law. Jefferson goes so far, at least in one of his early drafts, to suggest open secession. Now, Madison talked him out of that part, and ultimately, many of the national leaders at that time did not agree with Madison and Jefferson, but in my mind, the damage was already done by their willingness and to put their names, and everybody knew it's Jefferson. So here's Jefferson. Now, I think for Jefferson, he's acting out of his norm, right? When you read the Declaration of Independence and then you read the Kentucky resolutions, you're like, yep, that's the same guy. So at least in that part, he was being authentic to himself. But it sets the stage because the later movements will always point back to Jefferson. And when we did Jackson late last year, we looked at the nullification crisis in 1832, and when John C. Calhoun and South Carolinians are issuing their nullification statement against, at that point, a taxation bill, they're echoing Jefferson. Everybody knew they were talking about Jefferson. But even in New England, again, I'm wanting you to see that secession and division was not some surprise in 1860, but a common experience throughout the time period, reflecting how the founding peoples, and that's now the men and women, the 2.5, 3, 4 million people who founded the country, what they believed was their right. I'm not saying you and I have to agree with that or want that to be true for us, but I'm saying that's what they thought. Now, what's interesting when you get to the nullification crisis is you can, by this point now, you're 40 years on from the Constitution. You start seeing two major camps get laid out about how should the Constitution be understood. And this will be the ground that Lincoln works when he does his debate with Douglas in 1858, and then later when he's arguing in 60, 61, 62 with the South, he's arguing on this point. For Jefferson, for John C. Calhoun, and for those who followed them, the idea was that you could understand the Constitution as a compact. So it's known as the compact theory. And the general idea would be like joining a club. So you guys at Westminster, there's maybe a bridge club or a workout club or a club for the library, and you can join it if you wish. And so they thought the Constitution was like you joining that club. And of course, if you joined that club, every one of you would assume that 3, 6, 9 months later, if you didn't want to go anymore, you could leave that club. The club would not somehow own you at that time. This point would be made for them that, back to our founding, when the nation was founded, it was founded by individual groups who founded their own separate colony, only loosely connected back to England. In other words, it wasn't like all 13 colonies or the East Coast was founded all at once by the same group. So that's their mindset. For Adams, for John Adams, for Daniel Webster, for Jackson, for Lincoln, the argument will go the other direction, that no, it's a contract. And in the contract theory, the idea is said, really understood in the first phrase of the Constitution, we the people. So the idea being that, look, if you personally want to secede from the country, you can. You have the right of secession for you individually. Renounce your citizenship, get on a plane, take off, and you can secede from the country. But the unit known as Florida, the land of the peninsula, that cannot be extracted from the whole. So this division, this idea of the compact and contract theory becomes really important as we go forward, in the discussion. Now, slavery. Let me take a drink of water real quick. No, we've got a few more minutes. We can't escape slavery and its impact. One of the most tricky questions you can be asked by someone is, what's the main issue of the Civil War? And if you don't say slavery, you're in trouble. And yet, at the same time, the reality is the nuance is very, very deep of what all is going on. But what we must understand is slavery is the central focus. If we don't use the word main reason, we certainly must say it's the central focus of what leads us into the Civil War. And as you can see, we've had slavery involved almost from the beginning in the country. Before there was even colonies, there were slaves being forcibly kidnapped or bought and sold in Africa to Portuguese and eventually Spanish traders, eventually English traders being brought over. They get to what becomes the United States only in 1619, but it's really more important to see that a century before the English were coming, African slaves were being brought over. Slavery was legal throughout New England. It was legal in Florida. It was legal in Quebec. Florida and Quebec were both English colonies after the French Indian Wars. At the time of the founding, so Declaration and Constitution, there are approximately 1/5 of the number of people on the planet. And as you can see in both the Declaration and the Constitution, the majority of signers were slaveholders themselves personally. So this is around us, and it's in the mix of kind of what's going on. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that the idea of an anti-slavery is also born in the United States. Slavery is not born in the United States, but we can say anti-slavery is born in the United States. It's not to somehow give us a pass for having slavery, but I think sometimes when people are critical of the country and just want to be harsh, I think that they miss this side of the story also, in that out of the expression of slavery in the New World, in England, and then later in America, at the same time as the founding, as you can see for yourself, and I'll read it to you, there is a growing, active anti-slavery movement. And there were 4 or 5 people who were anti-slavery people at the Constitution signing, and they actually tried to get slavery in the mix. They fought against the 3/5 compromise. They were outvoted, obviously, and they lost. But I think it's worthy to note that they go this way. And as you can see, even before the Constitution, Pennsylvania votes as a state to abolish slavery. And by 1804, all the northern states north of Delaware and Virginia had abolished slavery. Again, make sure you get this. All of those states or colonies had slaves in them. So there were slave holders, some large slave holders in every one of those states. It's not accurate to say that there was like no slavery in the North. So of course they abolished slavery. No. They all had slaves, or slavery was there. And in some cases, particularly in the middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, which had really large farms. We think of them as urban, but there was a really large farm contingent. There was some slavery in those states, and so there would have been some, large slave holders, but they figured out a way to handle it. But the South couldn't go there, and they didn't go there, mostly because there was the assumption that, well, slavery is going to die out. One of the other decisions that was made about slavery was this concept of the slave trade, which was, ended in 1804. But it doesn't die out. And we see that with the Missouri Compromise issue. This will be the last thing we cover tonight. Let me show you through this part. So again, 1804, slavery is all gone in the North. 1809, the international slave trade has come to an end. And had you asked most people, including slaveholders in the 1790s, do you think slavery will remain an issue in America? They would have mostly said no, not likely. And they thought it would die out for a lot of different reasons, geography being one of those, economics being another one of those. But we can see by 1820 it hasn't happened. And that's because of the growth of the cotton gin, which brings cotton into the story, which we'll look at more next time. But let me just show you this, that we can see again, this idea of division is not far from us. For about 20 years, there had been no real debate. So if there were those early anti-slavery groups, by the early part of the 1800s, they kind of gotten quiet. You won't really hear much about them. They weren't meeting, they weren't saying things. They seemed kind of happy. And then in 1819, Missouri petitions for a statehood, the second state out of the Louisiana Purchase territory. Now, why was this controversial? Because it exploded rapidly. Well, one, because up to this point, the states had been largely equal in number and had, in the Senate, as you know, where it's 2 representatives per state, that allowed a balance to maintain. Now, by this point in the House, it was already clear that the more populated North was going to have more people. So for Southerners, it was critical to have at least this equal status in the Senate, if not the majority. So the Southerners, they didn't mind throwing this number off by having a 12th slave state and bringing the numbers off, but the Northern people weren't going to let that happen either. But it was also controversial because of where it was. So we look on this map over here, you can see, you know the country. I have to show my students the whole country to make sure they get it. But if this is Tennessee, right, as you know, in Kentucky, and Virginia's here, the idea of the slave trade being way up here was something no one had really considered. And this was really problematic for particularly the anti-slavery side of the country. Because if slavery, part of why with the Northwest Territories that slavery was abolished here, besides the idea of just freedom, was because, well, we won't really need slavery connected to agriculture up here. And that A, turned out not to be true, and B, there certainly was a lot of racism and even some hidden slavery in these 5 states up through the Civil War. But if you work with the premise that north of the Ohio River, there'd be no slavery because it wouldn't work there, then the admission of Missouri, which would go this far north, was problematic, because then it kind of ruined the whole philosophy and the whole idea of what could be done. So into our story, it's solved by our good friend Henry Clay, which if you were with us again, we did the Jackson look, you remember Clay was kind of his major opponent. And Clay suggested 2 alternatives, or a double plan. The first was we would break Maine off from Massachusetts and make it its own state, so that would bring a free state, Maine, in at the same time we brought in the slave state of Missouri. And then secondly, to deal with the geography, we would prohibit slavery north of 3630. So let me go back to this map here. 3630 is the low part of the Missouri border, right? So as I tell my students, the most southern part of Missouri would become the most northern boundary of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory. It's really important that you keep that in your mind. And of course, they said in Louisiana Purchase territory because that was all the land we had, right? But you and I know, because we also did a session on Manifest Destiny, back in 2019, that we're going to go past that line. It's going to be problematic. So this solves the problem and sort of left things in this kind of, okay, we're all basically okay with where things are as we're going forward. But you just look at the map and you can already see the problems that are going to come. First of all, Southerners are eventually going to get a copy of this map, and they're going to realize how they did not get a fair shake of half of the territory in the Louisiana Purchase territory. They're going to say, wait, we only got this little tiny bit down here, and you guys got all that way up there, so that's not fair. And as slavery is successful along this border with Illinois, it's going to put pressure on Illinois farmers who are going to feel like, wait a minute, why don't we get the same opportunities as these guys? And so you're going to have this growing pressure. But for now, the Missouri Compromise stalled things, but that does not end the issue, because at this very moment in the 1820s and 1830s, the Second Great Awakening is coming. And out of the Second Great Awakening, there will be 2 huge things that grow that lead us deeper towards the war. One is, as I already mentioned, Manifest Destiny, and the other is a renewed and resurgent anti-slavery movement, which this time will not be willing to let bygones be bygones. They will be as adamant as the slaveholders in the anti-slavery mind. If it meant some state or somebody wanted to secede, well, good riddance, because we are going to have a country that is only free and liberty for all, regardless of your color. And they will found the really first biracial, multiracial social movement in the history of the world, called the Underground Railroad, which will be hugely successful, which will be part of what provokes the further roll in. All right, so we didn't get as far as I wanted to. I really wanted to get I need about 10 more minutes, but I don't want to do it. I don't want to rush. And I just want to take our time, because there's a lot of information. I want you to kind of soak it in. And again, as I like to do all the time, nobody's put in a question, which is fine. If you have a question, we'll pause just for a second. If you want to ask a question now while you're thinking it, I'd be more than happy to make sure I answer that for you. Well, good. Okay. Well, you always know how to get to me. If you have a question that comes up in your mind in the next couple of days, you can send it to me by email. We'll start with that look at those 2 movements the anti-slavery movement, and Manifest Destiny, and we'll roll all that to 1850 so that the next time together, I promise, we'll be really marching down to look what are the actual events from the end of the Mexican War to Lincoln's election that kind of sparks that fire. And then the week after that, we'll be looking at the Constitution of the Confederacy and Bull Run and the early parts of the actual war itself. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Have a good evening. Talk to you next week.
Thank you, Paul. See you next week. Bye-bye.